So our next set of notes is going to be Roman numeral 5, Andrew Jackson's first term. As you can see in the picture, Andrew Jackson is going to be one of the President of the United States, and he is going to be one of the pivotal presidents in American history. We've already talked about in previous lectures because he's going to expand democracy in America. And he represents this new age of more common men in office. So, letter A, Jackson gets starting with his inauguration. Just like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson wanted to make a direct show that he is going to be more democratic and expand the power of the common man while in office. If you remember in the election of 1800, when Jefferson gets elected, he said it was a revolution. It was a victory for the common man, and he walked to make a show that he was a common man. He walked to his inauguration. Right? Andrew Jackson is going to lay out in his inauguration speech what his goals are, and all of them deal with typical democratic values of smaller federal government, more power to the states. So some of his goals that you can see, first one is he's going to retire the debt. If you remember, Alexander Hamilton put a debt in. He funded the debt at par because as long as the federal government has a debt, the states are going to be loyal to the federal government because it's paying off their debt, and they're getting tax revenue from the federal government for certain projects. And so that's why Alexander Hamilton passed it. Andrew Jackson is going to say we need to get rid of that because he wants to weaken the federal government. He doesn't believe that it should have all this debt, that it's a burden on the next generation, but also it makes the federal government too strong. States' rights. Just like Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson believes that the states should have more power for the simple reason that the states are more democratic. If you have a state government that's closer to the people have more say and control in what's going on in that state, rather than a federal government that's far away that they might not be able to ever visit and control. So again, he's all about democracy and weakening the federal government. He also says he's going to create a just Indian policy. For Jackson, a fair or just Indian policy means removing Indians, Native Americans, from where they are and putting them in the far west across the Mississippi River so that we have more land available for white farmers. He is definitely pro-farmer, and he believes that this will make him more popular with farmers who vote Democrat. Rotation in office. As we had talked about in a previous lecture, rotation in office is supposed to be democratic. It's the idea that you're going to have people get elected from the common man, go to Washington, D.C., serve their one term, and then go back to live among the common man. This is more democratic because when people come right from the common man to Washington, D.C., the problems that the common man, the farmer, faces is still fresh in their mind. The idea being the longer they stay in Washington, D.C., the less they're in touch with the common man, so have them rotate back to be regular citizens and bring a new person in. This means that not only is it democratic because people have more of a memory of what's going on because they just got elected from the common man, but it also means that more people get to partake and hold political office because instead of having one person who's in charge of, he's a senator or representative for 20, 30 years, we're going to have a whole series of people, so more people get to partake in the federal government. So this is kind of all representative of Jackson's inauguration party. Just like Jefferson, like I said, he wants to make some kind of a statement that this is now an era of the common man. And so in his inaugural ball, instead of just inviting elite people to come to the White House to celebrate his time in office, he has an open invitation to all citizens to come and, as you can see in the picture, come to the White House and have a party and enjoy this, revolution of 28. But what happens is the people show up. You can tell from the picture in the foreground there's lots of common people who are not dressed in top hats and have canes. They come, they show up, and as happens in many house parties, the White House gets trashed. The common men who are there start getting drunk somebody spikes the punch. They start trampling the White House, stealing the silver and the china. Some stuff starts to get destroyed. And so they quickly usher Jackson out the back door of the White House, and then they need to end the house party before they just trash the White House. And so they move the spiked punch outside. The crowd follows it out, and then they quickly lock the doors. This is going to, of course, be made fun of by Jackson's political enemies, the National Republicans. They're going to say, see what happens when you invite the common man into the White House and you give them power. They make a mess of everything. So they mockingly call Andrew Jackson King Mob because he's the king of the common men. So rotation office, as we had talked about on the previous slide, the rotation office is a noble idea. He's going to try to increase democracy in America by simply having just more people be able to be representatives if they rotate in and serve short terms. However, what actually happens is when he takes over, he fires a lot of the people who work in the federal government who were national Republicans or even leftover Federalists, and he replaces them with Democrats. He does this because he says it's going to be more democratic, and so your local postman, the local tax collector, what have you, they are going to get fired and they're going to be replaced by Democrats. So what really this results in is something called the spoil system that will be used by politicians for many years to come. It's just a way of rewarding your political people for supporting you in the election. So if you go out and you get people to vote for Jackson, you tell people to vote for Jackson, you do a banner, you give a speech, then you're expected to get a reward by getting some nice government job that you can use then to collect bribes and to get more money for yourself. And so this is called the spoil system because to the victor goes the spoils. So what we see here in this political cartoon is we see Jackson. He's drawn as a devil, so obviously this is drawn by some national Republican and opposing party. And all of these people down below are people who are looking, they're called office seekers. They're looking for some government job because they helped Jackson get elected. And so they want him to fire the previous people that were national Republicans or Federalists and give them the job. In Jackson's left hand, you'll see a plum. And a plum is just a name for an easy government job. And so they're all clamoring for him to throw down this plum, this government job, so they can get a job for the federal government and use that job to collect bribes to make themselves personally wealthy. Obviously, the spoil system is not at all what Jackson was anticipating. He wanted to make the rotation office be a democratic thing that was going to make America more open to the needs of the common man, but instead it created a more corrupt government. So we see in the other political cartoon, it's just another political cartoon that's criticizing the spoil system. Here we see Andrew Jackson sitting atop a pig, because a pig is greedy, and we see money signs all over it. And so, of course, this is referencing the idea that people will just get in the federal government not to benefit the common man, not to make the government run better, but to just enrich themselves. So they're greedy. To the victor goes the spoils, as we talked about before. Next, so number 3, King Andrew. We're going to talk about in this slide of how Andrew Jackson is going to be very heavy-handed and forceful when he's the president. So we start off with the Mayville Road Bill. The Mayville Road Bill is a bill proposed by Congressman Clay, if you remember Henry Clay, from Kentucky. And this is a bill that he sponsors that's going to build a road within his state, entirely within Kentucky. And the federal government is going to pay for it. So obviously this would help Clay's home state of Kentucky, would help trade and business grow. Jackson vetoes the bill, and this is odd. Presidents have rarely used the veto power before Andrew Jackson, and he's going to use it quite a bit. And one of the first time he uses it to veto the Mayville Road Bill. He vetoes it because he says that the bill is not constitutional. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the federal government can pay for roads that are going to be entirely built in one state. For that matter, it doesn't really say that they can build roads at all. And so he says this is certainly not constitutional because it's only going to benefit one state. And if Kentucky wants a road, then the state of Kentucky should build the state itself. So he vetoes it because it says it's not constitutional. This is an example of how Andrew Jackson is being a strict constructionist, which of course is a typical Democratic idea at the time. He also vetoes it for personal reasons. We didn't talk about this before, but Henry Clay, in the election of 1824, he keeps Andrew Jackson from getting elected president 4 years earlier than he was. Clay made a deal with John Quincy Adams. Well, at least that's the accusation, that he made a deal with John Quincy Adams to get John Quincy Adams made president instead of Andrew Jackson. That deal was called the corrupt bargain. And so Andrew Jackson has a personal vendetta against Clay because he blames him. He blamed Clay for not letting him be elected president 4 years earlier. And so Jackson is accused of vetoing Clay's bill on purely personal grounds as kind of political payback for not letting him get elected president, like I said, 4 years earlier. So what we see is that Jackson's political opponents start to call him jokingly, mockingly, King Andrew. He uses the veto 12 times during his presidency. That is more than all other previous presidents combined. So we see him acting as a king, exercising the veto power, saying no to Congress. We see this where he's dressed up as a king in the political cartoon. He has a crown on. You see in his left hand he has the veto. That's what he's using as his power in office. And at his feet, all torn up, is the Constitution that he's trampling on. So Andrew Jackson is certainly making enemies and going against what he had said, that he wants the federal government to be weak, when he, in fact, with his veto, is making the federal government and certainly the executive branch more powerful. The next issue that we're going to talk about under Jackson's administration is the Webster-Hayne Debate, one of the most famous political debates in American history. So it starts out with Daniel Webster, who is a national Republican and a Northerner, and he proposes a bill that's going to limit the sale of land out west. He doesn't like this. People in the Northeast don't like more states coming out west, because the more people move out west, the more states we have, and the more states we have, the less important the northeastern states are going to be in Congress. They're just going to be overwhelmed by numbers of western states. So this is going to reduce the Northeast power in Congress. So in order to keep that from happening, what he proposes is to sell fewer land out west, so fewer people leave and move out west, and so we have fewer western states. It is a purely sectional bill. It'll only help the Northeast. Because of this, of course, western states are going to stand up in Congress and oppose this bill. They're going to say it's wrong, it only helps the Northeast. They won't like it because the West won't get their free land, their population won't grow, and they won't like it at all. The South also doesn't like this because they, of course, as we've talked about in previous lectures, they're also moving west. Both of these sections, the West and the East, want land to be very cheap so they can continue to move west and add more to their political power. So again, we see it's written right there that this is an example. As America grows, we're going to see increased sectionalism. One part of the country is going to be upset about something that benefits another part of the country. So the person who is going to stand up and oppose this more forcefully than anybody else is Robert Hayne. He's from South Carolina, and he's going to lead the opposition. So we're going to have a debate here between Webster and Hayne. Now, when Hayne stands up and says he's opposed to this, he says that if it does pass, just in case this bill does pass, that the South and the West are going to nullify it. They are still going to sell land out west, which creates a big constitutional debate. Do states have the right to nullify? We've seen this before, of course, when we were talking about the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, or when we were talking about the nullification debate with the Tariff of 1828. And so once again, we see this issue rising in America. Is nullification valid? Who should have more power? Do the states have more power because they can nullify, or does the federal government have the power and they should be the ultimate authority? Webster stands up, as you see him in the picture, and he counters Robert Hayne's idea of nullification. He says, look, as a country, if we let states nullify, then the Union, the United States, the federal government is really just, as he calls, a rope of sand. If the North pulls one way and the South and West pull another, then what happens is that, as you can see, America just falls apart like sand through your fingers if you have a rope of sand. And so this debate is a great example of not only just sectionalism, but this idea that's going on between who should have more power, the states or the federal government. Next, big letter B, Jackson and the nullification crisis. Once again, an example of sectionalism and also the debate between national and state power. So, number one, South Carolina upset by the Tariff of 1828. So just review. If you remember, the Tariff of 1828 was created by John C. Calhoun, and he was trying to use it as a way to get Democratic Republicans elected. The Tariff of 1828 is an extremely high tariff, and of course it hurts the South, both as producers and consumers. It hurts them as consumers because when we raise tariff rates, it forces Americans to buy goods made in America, which of course are mostly made up in the Northeast. So the Tariff of 1828 did help out the Northeast as manufacturers, but it's going to desperately hurt the South as consumers, so sectionalism. In addition to that, when we put a tariff on goods coming from England or other countries, England and those other countries are going to put a tariff right back on us, and so they're not going to be buying American cotton or tobacco. So the South is now hurt as producers as well. Bottom line, the North is going to benefit from the tariff, the South is going to be hurt from the tariff. It's an example of a sectional issue. So if you remember, we called the tariff of 1828 those who were opposed to it the tariff of abominations. The South is always, the reason they're upset about the tariff is not just because of economic reasons, they're also afraid because of slavery. We have talked about in previous lectures that the South is hypersensitive around slavery. And how does this relate to slavery? Well, it really doesn't, but in the South mind, they think it does. If we have a strong government, a federal government that's strong enough to pass a tariff law, then they're afraid that we have a strong enough government that could pass laws banning slavery. They kind of use that slippery slope argument that if one thing can happen, then everything else can happen. And so they are trying to stop the tariff of 1828, not just because it hurts their economy, but also because they think it will lead the way to a stronger federal government that could one day outlaw slavery. The South is even more sensitive about slavery at this time because just recently we've had the Denmark-Vesey slave rebellion. You'll read more about this on your study cards, but in the South we had a slave rebellion and Denmark-Vesey rose up and he encouraged many slaves to follow him, and it was a major slave uprising that was only put down after a lot of bloodshed. So the South right now is very nervous that slavery will be ended because if it is, they have these visions of African Americans rising up all across the South and killing their white former owners. And so the South is desperately trying to avoid any hint or talk of the federal government being strong enough to get rid of slavery. In addition, in 1832, when we're talking about, in big letter B here, is that the South has already expressed their dislike for the tariff of 1828. If you remember the nullification, we had the whole nullification South Carolina exposition saying that we could nullify. The South is on record of saying we don't like this tariff, and so now it's been 4 years with this tariff, and they're tired of their economy suffering. Why is the tariff of 1828 an issue again in 1832? Well, because it's an election year. We're about to vote for another president. And in election years, people raise issues that they know can get them elected, that they can campaign for or against. Well, in 1832, politicians did pass another tariff to replace the 1828 tariff. It is the tariff of 1832. It was designed to lower tariff rates to make the South happy, but it barely lowered tariff rates, not enough to make the South happy. Plus, it was a tariff, and the South is against tariff, again, for two reasons. One, it hurts their economy, and two, they're afraid a strong federal government that could pass tariffs can get rid of slavery. And so if you're a Southerner, the tariff of 1832 does not go far enough to get rid of the tariff. And so the South is once again upset that we need either to get rid of the tariff altogether or to drastically lower it. So, once again, we see South Carolina in the forefront. Back in 1832, of course, they wrote the South Carolina Exposition saying we could nullify if we wanted to. Well, since the tariff is still there and hasn't been lowered all that much, South Carolina says enough is enough. We're actually going to nullify the tariff. We're not talking about it like we did in the South Carolina Exposition, but we're actually going to nullify it. So now the tariff in 1832 is nullified in South Carolina. When the federal government tries to send tax collectors down to collect taxes on the tariff, South Carolina says you can't do that, not in our state. This, of course, is a direct challenge to the federal government. If you remember from the Webster-Hayne Debate, if you allow states to nullify, then the federal government really has no power at all. South Carolina also says to keep this tariff from being enforced, they are actually going to use the state militia. They're going to use South Carolina troops to keep out federal tax collectors. So we're getting pretty close to civil war here between South Carolina and the federal government. If the federal government does send down troops to enforce their tariff, then South Carolina says that we will do the ultimate, we will leave the country, we will secede. South Carolina said it's their right to nullify, and if things are just so intolerable that they can't deal with the United States government anymore, that they will just leave the country and secede. Now, what does Andrew Jackson do? Andrew Jackson, as you remember, is a states writer. He believes that the states should have more power than the federal government. He also is anti-tariff because he believes it helps the elite and the Northeast. So he should support South Carolina in this nullification. However, Andrew Jackson doesn't. In fact, he will work against South Carolina. The reason he does this is because while he does believe in states' rights, he doesn't want to go so far as to destroy the Union. He has fought for his country in the War of 1812. He's the President of the United States, and he doesn't believe that we should go so far as to let states secede and completely flout federal authority. And so he says, look to South Carolina, you need to pay this tax. We will lower the tax, but don't threaten secession. I love the United States, and he is going to fight to defend it. Congress gives him the permission to do this with the force bill. The force bill says that the president has the right to use force to enforce the tariff of 1832. So it looks like we're headed to civil war. Andrew Jackson is going to be sending the military down to South Carolina to enforce the force bill, to make sure that the tariff is paid. And South Carolina says they'll oppose it with troops and they'll secede. We desperately need a compromise. So this is called the nullification crisis of 1832. If we're talking compromise, of course, we must be talking Henry Clay. So Henry Clay comes to the rescue again. If you remember, he also helped us avoid any conflict or sectional disputes with the Missouri Compromise back in 1820. So Henry Clay, also known as the Great Compromiser, he says, look, what we're going to do is we're going to keep the tariff. The federal government needs to be able to everybody understand that they are the final say. So we will keep the tariff. But to make South Carolina happy and the South as a section, he says we will slowly lower tariff rates all the way back down to the original tariff rates of 1816, America's first protective tariff. So over time, we will ratchet down tariff rates. That makes the South happy. It also makes Andrew Jackson and the North happy because the federal government does get to get their tariff. They do get the idea that the federal government does have the power to force states to do things, and nullification, for the moment, seems discredited. However, John C. Calhoun, who you can see now in the right-hand picture, he's aged quite a bit, he says that the struggle so far from being over is not more than fairly commenced. Calhoun understands something, that this whole tariff, this whole nullification idea, while being temporarily put on the back burner, has not really been settled. Long term, do the states have the right to nullify? Do the states have the right to secede? Who should have more power, the federal government or state government? These questions have not been answered by this compromise. We've just kind of pushed the issue back. Eventually, as Calhoun correctly says, we will have to solve these questions, answer these questions, and that, of course, will be some of the primary causes of the Civil War. Next, Jackson and the battle over the Bank of the United States. Of course, this is an election year. It's 1832, and so the bank is going to come up as a campaign topic again. Now, the bank is supposed to expire in 1836, in 4 years, but Jackson hates the bank. Jackson doesn't believe that the bank should allow to go its full time that Congress approved and die in 1836. He wants to kill the bank now. As we see in the political cartoon, Jackson is battling the bank. The bank is shown in this cartoon as a many-headed hydra that is composed by the elite. If we could look at this political cartoon closer, you would understand that some of the heads of this monster are the elite of America. They're those East Coast elite in the North who own the bank and who control the money system in America, who control the economy in America. The other reason that Jackson hates the bank is because not only is it controlled by elite Northeasterners, but it also is controlling Congress. Many members of Congress owe money to the National Bank. In order to run their business or get elected, they had to take out loans. And so he's afraid that the National Bank is able to control the people's government, Congress. Another reason he hates the bank is because most of the newspapers in America, the major newspapers, they had to borrow money from the National Bank to create new printing machines, to open up warehouses, and so forth. And so he is afraid that the press is controlled by the elite through the bank. All totaled, if you think of it all together, Jackson thinks that the bank is just the way that the elite control America, and so he wants to kill it. He wants to do battle with it. So we've talked about how it's not democratic. Then the final reason that we're going to talk about why he doesn't like the bank is because a lot of the investors in the bank were British. Andrew Jackson lost relatives to the Revolutionary War fighting the British. He fought in the War of 1812 against the British himself. He doesn't like the British, plus that the British have a government that's controlled by the elite. And of course, Jackson is against control by the elite. And so he doesn't like the British having so much control over the bank, which means the British have control over Congress and our press. So Andrew Jackson vetoes the bank extension bill. What happened in 1832 is some of the National Republicans were trying to increase the life of the bank by saying that let's go ahead and re-up it for another 20 years, 4 years early. It's not so important that you understand the reasoning behind this. The most important thing is that Andrew Jackson is going to say we shouldn't have the bank continue. The bank is anti-democratic, it's controlled by the elite, and he believes it's not constitutional. No matter what McCulloch versus Maryland said earlier under John Marshall, he doesn't believe that the bank is constitutional. He doesn't believe in loose construction. So the results. Andrew Jackson extends the power of the presidency. Once again, we're seeing Andrew Jackson use his veto power. So if you remember from a previous slide, this is an example of him being accused of King Andrew. Next, Andrew Jackson is the man. Farmers, local bankers, states writers, and speculators all applaud Jackson for taking on the bank. So let's talk about each one of those. Farmers, they don't like the National Bank because the National Bank does not want to lend money out in fiat money. The National Bank wants to use specie. They want to make sure that when they loan people money, they pay it back in money that has value, not paper money, not fiat money. And so farmers are finding it really difficult to pay back their loans that they borrowed to start their farm. So they want to get rid of the National Bank, and they want to have local state banks. Local state banks are much more likely to engage in lending money out that's fiat money, that's worthless money. So it becomes easier for the farmers to pay back their loans. And so that's why farmers are against the National Bank. Next, local bankers. They also don't like the bank because it's competition. If you own your own little mom and pop bank in Maryland or Virginia or Kentucky, you want to be able to loan money out without any competition. And the National Bank, the Bank of the United States, is a major competitor of all those local state banks. And so the local bankers want to get rid of the National Bank just for competition reasons. States writers also want to get rid of the bank because, again, they think that the bank is controlled by the elite. It makes the federal government powerful. And the people who believe in states' rights, they want all the power to go back to the states. And then land speculators. Land speculators are people who move out west and they buy land cheaply and then they turn around and sell it to farmers for more expensive prices. Well, they can only do that if they can get access to a lot of cheap paper money. We are talking they need to get loans of millions of dollars so they can go out and buy up thousands and thousands of lands of acres out west. And they can only get that amount of money if local state banks are willing to loan them fiat money. The National Bank was not willing to loan land speculators money. So for all of these reasons, people on the frontier, people out west, whether they be farmers, local banks, states writers, or speculators, they're all applauding Andrew Jackson's veto of the bank. So Jackson becomes very popular with the common man for getting rid of the bank. So we see this is finally another sectional issue. The Northeast desperately wanted to keep the bank because they're businessmen, they're merchants, they're manufacturers, and they know America needs a bank. And for the reasons I've just talked about, the South and the West want to get rid of the bank, and so we see once again one section of the country pitted against another. Indian removal. Andrew Jackson, if you remember from the second slide of this presentation, that Andrew Jackson promised when he was elected a just or fair Indian policy, which means, as I had said, that he wants to get rid of Native Americans and move them west. Now, the reason he calls this just, and the reason we see this political cartoon of Father Jackson taking care of his quote-unquote Indian children, is that Andrew Jackson says that he needs to move the Indians out west because they are being corrupted by white culture, and that they won't be able to hold on to their native culture unless he moves them out west so they're away from white culture. So Andrew Jackson says that the reason he's moving the Indians out west is because he wants to maintain their culture. However, most historians have now looked at this and said really the primary reason he wants to move Indians west, called Indian removal, is because he wants to free up land for white farmers, who of course are his primary constituents and voters. So once again we see the picture of the common man farmer, and he certainly wants Jackson to get rid of Native Americans. So in 1830, we get this thing called the Indian Removal Act. It's passed by Congress, signed into law by Jackson, and it gives the president the authority to use the United States Army to round up Native Americans and move them into the trans-Mississippi West, which means across the Mississippi, the far west, where there aren't a lot of white farmers at the current time. So we clear up all the land that the Native Americans did occupy, and now more and more white farmers, as we can see on the left, are going to be happy with Andrew Jackson. So let's give you examples that you can use in an essay to talk about Indian removal. So if you look at the map, you can see some of the Indian or Native American tribes that are still living among white people in the southeast are the Cherokee Indians, the Creek Indians, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Seminole. These are the primary Indian groups that are living among white people. Of course, white people want the land that the Cherokee and the Chickasaw are living on at this point. It's good land that you could grow cotton or tobacco on. And so, according to the Indian Removal Act, Jackson has the right to remove these Indians out west. Some of these Native Americans, though, especially the Cherokee, known as one of these civilized tribes, they had adopted white culture. The Cherokee Indians are famous for saying, look, we can't fight white people. There's just too many of them. And so if we're like them, then maybe they'll accept us and we can live next to them in peace and harmony and still stay on our ancestral lands. So the Cherokee Indians had adopted white culture. They had created their own written language like white people had. They created their own constitution. They even had adopted cotton production and owned slaves and had plantations, trying to prove to the white America who lives around them that we should be able to live next to you in peace because we have adopted many aspects of your culture. So we see here one of the Cherokee Indians, and he's showing you the alphabet that they went ahead and created. And so you see just a list of all the stuff I talked about: creating a written language, creating a constitution, adopting cash crop farming, owning slaves. And so we see the Cherokee as one of the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes. This is all well and good, and most of the land that the Cherokee were occupying was, as you can see on the map, upcountry land. It was land that was in the mountains of the southern Appalachian Mountains, and so not a lot of white people actually wanted this land. It was much easier to move west into the flatlands of Alabama and Mississippi and grow cotton, rather than trying to grow cotton on the hills of northwest Georgia. But this all changed when gold was discovered on Cherokee land. Of course, then white people start flooding into Cherokee land, and the Cherokees say this can't happen. We were promised by treaty that we would have this land, and so of course they sue the state of Georgia. They say to the state of Georgia, you gave us a treaty that said this land would be ours forever. You have to keep your own citizens out of Cherokee land. So they sue. Instead of fighting, this is one of the civilized tribes, and so they sue versus Georgia in 1831. The Supreme Court rules in favor of the natives. They say, yes, the natives do indeed have a valid treaty with the state of Georgia, and the state of Georgia should honor it. However, Andrew Jackson, who's the President of the United States, he is for Indian removal, and so he has the famous quote. He says, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Basically, Andrew Jackson does not lift a finger to help these Native Americans, these Cherokees, keep their ancestral land because he's for Indian removal and he doesn't care what the Supreme Court says. So we can also see this as another example of Andrew Jackson acting as King Andrew, completely ignoring one of the branches of government in favor of his policy of Indian removal. Next, let's go even further south and talk about Native Americans in Florida. If you remember from a previous lecture, we talked about Chief Osceola leading raids out of Florida into Georgia. Well, now that the United States has control of Florida, there are going to be more and more white people living in the panhandle of Florida. But very few white people move into the part of Florida that drops down into the Gulf of Mexico because it's swampland. It's the Everglades. And so Chief Osceola was continuing to lead rebellions, raids of Native Americans out of the Everglades and attacking white settlers who were encroaching upon their lands and then fleeing back into the Everglades. And so the United States is going to launch a war against, sorry about the bell. Sorry. So the United States is once again going to send the United States Army down to try to track down Chief Osceola and attack him. There's a lot of U.S. casualties. There's over 1,500 estimated U.S. casualties. That includes men in the Army and as well as citizens that Chief Osceola and the Seminole Indians attack in their raids. The reason the United States government has such a tough time about this, like I said, is because Osceola just melts back into the Everglades, and the United States Army can't find him. We get lost. We get stuck in the Everglades. And so this fighting goes on for several years. Eventually, the United States sends a flag of truce to Chief Osceola. They say, look, this war is hurting both of us, so let's talk together and maybe we can work something out. So Chief Osceola goes to talk with the Americans under a white flag of truce, and then the United States government uses that white flag of truce to capture him. And so the war basically comes to, for the most part, to an end. Without their leader, the Native Americans, the Seminole Indians, don't have much success leading raids against the white settlers. And so from that point on, we see in the map that the Indian Removal Act kicks in, and the defeated Seminole Indians are moved all the way west out of their native Everglades into Oklahoma, which of course is a much different climate, and the Native Americans are going to have a very difficult time surviving in Oklahoma. Perhaps the best example of this is the Trail of Tears. What you see is the Cherokee Indians, and we know that in the 1830 Indian Removal Act, Andrew Jackson has the power to remove Indians, and so he does, because white settlers want their land because there's gold on it. The United States government is going to go down with the United States Army. We're going to round up the Cherokee Indians and move them, as you can see from the previous slide, move them all the way west of the Mississippi into Oklahoma. And so we see the Trail of Tears. It's a forced march. It's where we make Indians leave with very few of their possessions, only what they can put on their backs or in a wagon, and we see them marched west in the wintertime to Oklahoma, a land that they have no idea how to survive in. So before they even get to Oklahoma, about 4,000 of the Native Americans who go, about 15,000 of them die on the 162-day journey. So definitely a difficult time in American history for Native Americans, as we see men, women, children, old and young, being forced to move out of their ancestral lands into Oklahoma, where of course more of them will die, not knowing how to survive on the reservations that's been created for them in a much more arid Oklahoma than what they're used to in Georgia. What about Indians in the Northwest? So we've dealt with Indians in the South and the Southwest. Is there any Native Americans that are struggling against white encroachment in the Northwest? Now, if you remember, the War of 1812 got rid of the Indian threat in the Ohio and Indiana with the Battle of the Thames and the Battle of Tippecanoe. But now when you see white settlers moving a little bit further west into Illinois, into Wisconsin and Minnesota, and so they're going to run into Sauk and Fox Indians, as you can see on the map right there in northwest Illinois. The Indians who live in this region, they realize that they have to do something. They cannot keep letting white settlers move in, and so they try to move further west themselves. But the problem is when they start to move onto the Great Plains further west, they run into the Sioux Indians. The Sioux Indians are a Great Plains tribe in the northern Great Plains, and they certainly don't want these Indians from Illinois moving into their territory. And so we have these Indians kind of stuck between two groups. If they stay where they are, they're going to be captured or killed by white settlers. If they move west, they're going to be killed by fellow Indians, the Sioux Indians. And so, led by Chief Black Hawk, as we see in the picture, they decide that they'd rather, if they're going to die, if they're going to fight, they might as well fight for their ancestral homelands. So they move back into northwestern Illinois and southern Wisconsin and eastern Iowa. This, of course, creates the Black Hawk Wars, where the Native Americans, led by Chief Black Hawk, are trying to take back their lands from white settlers who have moved in their absence. The Illinois militia puts down the rebellion, and so once again we see Caucasian and Native American conflict on the frontier. Notable participants, there's going to be a young Illinois man named Abraham Lincoln, the first time we've talked about him, who will fight in the Black Hawk War. Also, another man from Kentucky named Jefferson Davis. Both of these guys will be presidents of the United States at the same time during the Civil War, one for the North, one for the South. So we will see the Civil War generation starting to appear at this time.